They say the land remembers what people forget. The Llano Estacado doesn't care about your grief. It doesn't soften for widows or slow down for the seasons a woman spends talking only to her horses and the wind coming off the caprock. It just sits there, flat and ancient and indifferent, daring you to last another winter. Margaret Adler had lasted 11 of them. 11 years since the wagon rolled away with everything she'd intended to keep. 11 years of patching her own roof, pulling her own water, planting seeds in ground that cracked like old porcelain and sometimes just laughed at her. 11 years of neighbors who stopped being neighbors after the first 4, who moved on or gave up or simply vanished into the distance the way everything eventually did out here. She had not become hard. That's what people assume about women who survive alone, that survival calcifies them, turns them to stone, makes them the kind of women who don't cry and don't reach out and have eyes like locked doors. Margaret was not that. She had become still. There is a difference. Stone doesn't feel the cold. Stillness does, it just doesn't flinch. So when the 7 riders appeared on the ridge that January morning, silhouettes cut against a sky the color of a bruise healing, she stood in her doorway and she felt the cold, and she felt something older than fear move through her chest, and she did not flinch. She just watched them come. What happened in the next 4 days would not be recorded in any official ledger. No soldier filed a report. No newspaper carried the story. The only account that survived is the one Margaret herself wrote in the margins of a Lutheran hymnal she kept beside her bed, cramped, urgent handwriting that began mid-thought, as if she'd grabbed the pen mid-breath and never quite let it go. I found that hymnal in 1887, in a trading post outside Tascosa, sitting in a box of abandoned effects no one had claimed. I should not have read it. I read every word. What follows is what she wrote, and what, I believe, she was too careful to say directly. My name is Thomas Ellery Marsh, and I will tell you up front that I am a poor choice of narrator for this story. I am a cataloger. A taxonomist of the mundane, hired by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1881 to document cultural encounters and incidents of note along the Texas Panhandle, which is a bureaucratic way of saying, go out there and write down whatever strange thing happens before it disappears. I keep 3 journals simultaneously. I have opinions about ink viscosity. I once missed a genuine historical skirmish because I was reorganizing my field notes by subject heading. I fidget with my pen cap when I'm nervous. I'm almost always nervous. I have been told I have the natural presence of a man apologizing for himself in advance. So when Margaret Adler's account fell into my hands, her sharp-angled handwriting pressed so hard into the margins of that hymnal that I could feel the letters from the back of the page, raised like braille. I understood immediately that I was not equipped for it. The woman who wrote those words had lived something I had only theorized about, had only approached from a cataloger's safe distance. I read it anyway. I have been reading it, in some form, for 6 years. She wrote the entry for January 11, 1876, in 3 distinct sittings. I can tell by the ink 2 shades, and 1 passage in what appears to be the watered-down remnant of a nearly dry well. The words get lighter toward the end of certain paragraphs, then darken again, as if she walked away, refilled something, and came back with fresh resolve. January 11th. Cold enough to crack thinking. Woke before dawn to Hector making noise, not his coyote noise, his other noise, the one he makes when the thing he smells has a heartbeat and a direction. Stood at the window a long time before I could make them out. 7. On the ridge. Sitting horses the way people sit who have been on horses since before sitting was a learned thing. Did not reach for the rifle. Don't know why. Will think on that. She doesn't explain the decision. She just reports it, the absence of the reaching, the fact of the stillness, and then moves to the next thing as if the most consequential choice she would make that morning deserved no more ceremony than noting the weather. I have spent considerable effort thinking about why she didn't reach for the rifle. I think it was the horses. She writes, later in that same entry, about the quality of how the riders sat, the way people sit who have been on horses since before sitting was a learned thing, and I believe Margaret Adler, who had been working horses alone for 11 years, recognized something in that. A fluency. A relationship between animal and rider that precedes training and belongs to something deeper, something she understood the way musicians understand each other across the distance of a concert hall before a single note is played. She didn't reach for the rifle because she was, in some wordless way, already in conversation. What she does not write about, what I have had to piece together from the physical evidence of the hymnal itself, from interviews conducted years later, from a conversation with a Quaker missionary named Elias Brock who passed through that region in the spring of 1876 and heard things, is what the previous 11 years had actually cost her. I will tell it plainly, since she would not. Her husband, a German immigrant named Friedrich Adler, had come to the Llano Estacado in 1863 with the specific intention of proving something to a brother back in Mannheim who had called him soft. He bought 160 acres of caprock land with inheritance money that Margaret always referred to, in later correspondence, simply as the Adler trouble, 2 words that contained, I suspect, an entire inheritance dispute and, possibly a funeral. Friedrich was not a cruel man, by any account. He was an optimistic one, which in that country is sometimes worse. He died of a fever in the summer of 1865, which was the summer their daughter Lena was 4 years old. Margaret buried him on the eastern edge of their land, under a post oak that was the only tree for miles in any direction, which suggests to me that Friedrich Adler had either an instinct for beauty or an instinct for shade, and both would have been useful in that landscape. She stayed. This is the part people always want explained. They want the practical reasons, the money, the lack of wagon, the child too young to travel safely. And there are practical reasons. But Margaret Adler was a practical woman, and practical women know when practical reasons are proxies for something they don't yet have language for. She stayed because leaving felt like admitting the land had one. She stayed because the post oak was there. She stayed because she had become, in some way she couldn't entirely catalog, the woman who could survive it. And that woman could not yet exist anywhere else. Lena died of a lung sickness in the winter of 1870. She was 9 years old. She had her father's optimism and her mother's eyes. Margaret's account of this, in a letter to her sister in Ohio that I found in a county archive in Amarillo, is 7 lines long. 6 of them are practical. The 7th is, I have moved the 2nd chair to the barn. That is everything she ever wrote about it. By 1876 she had the following: 80 acres still productive, a 2-room house she'd replastered 3 times, for horses, a dog named Hector, 1 milk cow, a kitchen garden that she described in her planting records as adversarial but responsive, and a stillness that visitors, the few who came, consistently described as either peaceful or unsettling, depending on what they'd brought with them when they arrived. She had not stopped being warm. That's important. The woman who stood in her doorway watching 7 Comanche riders crest her ridge was not a woman who had turned the world away. She had simply stopped needing it to come toward her in order to survive. She had become self-sufficient in a way that is genuinely rare and genuinely dangerous, because the self that is sufficient unto itself begins, imperceptibly, to forget what it means to receive something. To let something in. The writers changed that. Not immediately. Not without friction. Not without the full weight of 11 years of earned wariness pressing against it. But they changed it. January 11th, continued. They came down from the ridge at mid-morning. Slow. No rifles shown. The lead rider, older man, face like the land here, all erosion and patience, stopped at the edge of my property line, which is marked by the remains of a fence I stopped rebuilding after the 3rd time the wind took it. He spoke. I don't have the language. I have approximately 40 words of Comanche acquired from a trader in Clarendon named Pete Soto who may have been making half of them up. I used 6 of them in a row and I think at least 2 were wrong. The older man listened to all 6. He said something to the rider on his left. The rider on his left, young, maybe 17, with the specific expression of someone trying very hard not to laugh, said something back. The older man looked at me for a long time. Then, he pointed at my well. I have read this passage approximately 400 times. I keep returning to the moment she deploys her 6 words, the courage of that, the absurdity of it, the way she just reached into her 40-word vocabulary and, threw everything she had at a situation that dwarfed it entirely. That is not a woman who has locked her doors. That is a woman who has been alone so long that she has forgotten the particular vulnerability of trying and failing in front of people. Or she remembers it perfectly and has simply decided it's worth it. The well. She had water. It was January and the creek bed on the northern edge of the property had frozen solid. The well, hand-dug, lined with river stones she'd hauled from 15 miles away over the course of one summer, had not frozen. She looked at 7 riders and one old man's pointed finger. "I thought about Friedrich," she writes. Not his face. Just the fact of him. The way a house knows a piece of furniture is gone not by remembering it but by feeling the space it left. I thought, he would have already had the bucket out. So I got the bucket. She doesn't romanticize what followed. This is one of the things about her account that I find most trustworthy. She records confusion, awkwardness, the specific social friction of two parties who share no language and a great deal of mutual wariness attempting something as intimate as hospitality. The horses drank. Hector made his coyote noise at a paint mare and was ignored with a dignity that Margaret found impressive. She heated something, she writes, the rabbit stew, which was mostly turnip by this point, and set it outside on the flat rock she used as a table in good weather, which this was not, and stepped back. She stood at the corner of her house. They stayed outside. This arrangement, she notes, seemed to satisfy some protocol she didn't understand but could feel operating, the way you can feel the shape of furniture in a dark room. The young rider, the one who'd almost laughed, dismounted and came forward first. He looked at the stew. He looked at her. He said something that ended with a rising inflection, which she interpreted as a question, which she answered by gesturing at the pot and, then, at herself in a way she describes as almost certainly ridiculous. He took the pot. He carried it back to the others. He did not keep any for himself until the oldest man had eaten. Margaret watched this. "I don't know why it broke something open in me," she writes. "It was just a boy respecting an elder. I've seen that. But I hadn't seen it in a long time. I hadn't seen anyone defer to anyone. I hadn't seen people be people together right in front of me and I couldn't count how long. I stood at the corner of my house and I watched a boy wait for an old man to eat, and I held onto the wall because my legs had gone strange." She doesn't name the feeling. She didn't need to. I named it for her, the first time I read it, alone in a trading post outside Tascosa with the wind hitting the walls and her handwriting going lighter and lighter as the ink ran low. Loneliness does not announce itself. It waits until you're watching a boy pass a pot of soup to an old man, and then it rises up and knocks your legs out from under you while you're standing perfectly still. The writers did not leave that evening. This was not what Margaret had expected, and her account of realizing they intended to stay, the slow understanding of it, the calculation happening behind her face while she watched them make small, efficient camp at the far side of her property, is one of the most compressed pieces of emotional writing I have encountered in a career built on reading other people's accounts of extraordinary things. January 11th, final entry. They're staying. I can see the fire from the window. Hector is watching it too. Neither of us has an opinion that feels finished yet. The rifle is where it always is. I didn't move it. She goes to sleep. The fire burns outside. For the first time in 11 winters, there are people between Margaret Adler and the dark. She doesn't say how that felt. She doesn't say anything else for the night. But the handwriting in the next morning's entry, January 12th, the ink fresh, the pen held with what I can only describe as a different pressure, starts not with an observation but with a single word, sitting alone at the top of the margin like she wrote it before she was fully awake, before the cataloging instinct kicked in, before she remembered that she had decided not to need things, warm. Just that. Warm. I should tell you about Elias Brock, the Quaker missionary, before I go further. He matters to this. Elias came through the Panhandle in March of 1876, 2 months after the events in Margaret's hymnal, and he was the first person she spoke to at length about what had happened. He recorded their conversation in his own journal, a meticulous, densely packed document I found at the Friends Historical Library in Philadelphia while chasing a completely unrelated research thread with the particular care of a man who understood that he was hearing something that wanted to be preserved. What I find striking about Elias's account, set against Margaret's own, is how differently they describe the same woman. Margaret, in the hymnal, is spare. Tactical. She records events the way a farmer records weather. This happened, this followed, here is the consequence. There is almost no interior commentary. When something breaks through the boy with the soup, the word warm, it breaks through because she isn't signaling it. Because the rest is so controlled. Elias describes her as a woman who laughed more than she meant to, and caught herself each time, as if laughter was a door she kept accidentally opening onto a room she'd decided not to use. I've carried that image for 6 years. She was not a woman who had stopped being warm. She was a woman who had stopped being unguarded. And warmth, for Margaret Adler, lived on the same floor as unguarded. She kept the door shut to both of them together, and, when one opened the other came with it, and the laughter was the sound the door made on its hinges. The 7 writers, over 4 days, oiled those hinges. Not on purpose. Not as a project. They were not in the business of reclaiming widows from their self-imposed prisons of stillness. They were in the business of surviving January on the Llano Estacado, which is a full-time occupation that leaves no margin for secondary missions. They oiled those hinges simply by being present. By existing in her sightline with full, unapologetic humanity. By doing things that were ordinary and, therefore, to Margaret, devastating. January 12th. The older man, I have decided to call him the elder in this account, not because he would call himself that, but because I don't have another word and I need to call him something woke before I did. I know this because when I came out to check on the horses at first gray light, he was already standing at the far edge of the property looking east. Not looking at anything specifically. Just east. Like east was a conversation he was continuing. I went past him to the barn. He didn't turn around. Neither did I. This felt, somehow, like an agreement. What Margaret is describing, I think, is the particular companionship of shared silence between people who have individually become fluent in silence. She had her 11 years of it. The elder, I will keep her name for him, it seems right, had whatever decades and distances had taught him. 2 people who had learned to be alone, encountering each other's solitude and recognizing it the way veterans recognize each other on civilian streets. Not the same wound. Just the same posture. She fed the horses. He continued his conversation with East. At some point she describes glancing toward him and seeing that he had sat down in the dead grass and was doing something with his hands, something small, focused, and she deliberately didn't look more carefully because she understood, she writes, that whatever it was private in the way that morning things are private. She went inside and made coffee. She made enough for 2. She brings this out. Sets the second cup on the flat rock. Goes back inside. 5 minutes later, she looks out the window. The cup is gone. I felt like I'd won something, she writes. I don't know what. I don't think I'll try to name it. The young writer who'd almost laughed, she calls him the boy in her account, with the same utilitarian logic as the elder, came to the barn while she was mucking out the stalls. This was around mid-morning. He came in without announcing himself and stood in the doorway watching her work with an expression she describes as purely professional, the way one carpenter watches another carpenter to understand their technique. She kept working. He came in and began, without asking, to help. She describes being so caught off guard by this that she nearly fell off the stool she was using to reach the upper rack. The boy caught the stool. Their eyes met at the height of the catch, her up, him down, both slightly startled by the accidental choreography of it. He said something. She said her 6 Comanche words again, in a different order. He looked at her the way people look at you when you've said something that is technically grammatical but deeply wrong. Then, he laughed. Not the polite, suppressed almost laugh from the day before. A real one. She laughed too. I don't know what I said, she writes. Asterisk whatever it was apparently the funniest thing he'd heard in some time. He had to put down the pitchfork. I was laughing at the laughing more than anything else. Hector came in to investigate the noise, which made it worse. I haven't laughed like that since asterisk she stops the sentence there. The dash is long. Like she held the pen on the page for a moment before deciding to leave the calculation unfinished. Since when, Margaret? She never says. I think she knew, and decided that knowing was enough, and that writing it down would make it a number, and she didn't want it to be a number. The second morning brought the thing that shifts the account from interesting to, I don't have a precise taxonomic term for what it becomes. Essential, maybe. The kind of document that isn't about what it describes but about something it can only approach from the side. One of the 7 writers was sick. She hadn't known. The camp was far enough, and private enough, that she'd seen the shape of 7 people and assumed 7 healthy people. But, at mid-morning the elder came to the door, which he had not done, which meant something was past the point of peripheral, and, when she opened it he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who needs something and is calculating the cost. She recognizes that expression. I know that face, she writes. I have made that face. It is the face of a person who has spent a long time being sufficient and is standing at the exact edge of where sufficient stops. He said something. Several things. She understood none of it. He pointed back toward the camp. She put on her coat. The sick writer was a woman. Margaret doesn't flag this with any particular surprise, which I find illuminating. She just describes her, a woman approximately my age, or older. I have difficulty telling, she is someone who has lived hard and worn it differently than I have. Lying on her side by the fire. Breathing in the specific way that means the chest is working too hard. She knows that breathing. She'd heard it in Lena. In Friedrich. In the thin winter air of this particular piece of caprock that seemed to collect lung sickness the way low ground collects water. She knew exactly what it was. She also knew exactly how much she could do about it. My medicine box is a study in optimism over evidence, she writes. I have mustard. I have some dried elder bark that Pete Soto sold me 2 winters ago as a lung remedy, which I have never trusted. I have whiskey, which is the only thing in the box I'm certain of. I went back to the house and got all of it. What follows in the account is the most practically detailed passage in the entire hymnal. Margaret Adler, working without shared language, in a camp that is not hers, with people she has known for less than 2 days, performs what amounts to a complete inventory of her limited medical knowledge. She describes making a mustard plaster with the focused efficiency of someone who has done it before and knows both its value and its ceiling. She describes holding the sick woman up to help her breathe, the physical logistics of it, the way the woman's weight distributed, the smell of the campfire and the cold air and the specific human smell of someone fighting their own body. She doesn't describe being afraid. I think she was afraid the whole time. I think she had learned to move inside her fear instead of around it, which is something that 11 years of solo survival on the Llano Estacado will teach you if you are willing to be taught, and Margaret had been very willing. The sick woman's name, I learned this from Elias Brock, who heard it from Margaret, was something that Margaret rendered in her account only as a sound she couldn't transliterate, and later as the woman with the blue-gray blanket, which is how she identified her from a distance. The blue-gray blanket woman looked at Margaret while Margaret worked on her. Not in the watchful, wary way the others had initially looked at her. She looked at Margaret the way people look at you when they have decided, without consultation, to trust you, a decision you can feel being made, a thing that moves across a person's face the way a cloud shadow moves across flat ground. Margaret felt it. She took my hand at one point, Margaret writes. Not because she was frightened. Just, she took my hand. And I let her keep it for a while. I don't think either of us was going to explain it to anyone. The mustard plaster wasn't going to fix a lung sickness. Margaret knew that. She also knew that warmth helps. That presence helps. That being held up instead of lying flat changes how air moves through a struggling chest. That these things are not miracles and are not nothing. She stayed until the woman's breathing steadied, not healed, not cured, but steadied, the particular plateau that means the body has agreed to fight rather than surrender for now. She went back to her house. She sat in the kitchen in her coat because she hadn't taken it off and was too tired to notice. I think about what I could have done differently, she writes. Not with her specifically. With the years. The sitting still. The chair in the barn. Whether stillness is wisdom or just grief that's learned to hold its shape. She doesn't answer the question. She gets up and puts water on for coffee. That evening she did something she had not done in 11 years. She invited people inside. It wasn't the whole camp. She didn't have space or chairs or enough of anything. But she went to the fire and she gestured at her house, the door, the lamplight visible in the window, the universally legible grammar of "come in if you want to," and the elder and the boy and the woman with the blue-gray blanket came. They sat on the floor because she had 2 chairs and she was not equipped for 7. She made the rabbit stew again, mostly turnip again, she notes, with what I believe is the very specific humor of someone who was aware of the gap between what they're offering and what the occasion deserves, and they ate. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much to speak with. But there was a fire, and there was lamplight, and there were people in Margaret Adler's house who were alive and present and who had taken her hand and laughed at her terrible Comanche and waited for an old man to eat before eating themselves. She writes about this part of the evening in one paragraph that begins with the inventory of what she served and ends, without transition, 7 sentences later, "Here, I had forgotten that a room full of people has a sound. Not any particular voice. Just breath. Movement. The sound of other lungs doing what lungs do." I sat in my chair and I listened to it and I thought about the chair in the barn. I am going to bring the chair back inside. That's the last line of January 12th. No explanation. No ceremony. No 11 years of significance announced or acknowledged. She's going to bring the chair back inside. The white space after that line is the largest in the entire hymnal. She must have sat there with the pen in her hand for a while. I like to think she was listening to the room. I need to stop and confess something about my methodology, which is what we call it when we mean the story of how I got here. I came to the Panhandle in 1881 ostensibly to document what the Bureau called cultural contact incidents, their phrase, which manages to drain approximately all of the blood from whatever it describes. I had a mandate, a per diem, a mule named Francis who had strong opinions about mud, and a conviction, inherited from my training, that history is a collection of events that happen to other people. By the time I found Margaret's hymnal, I had been on the road for 7 months and had filled 2.5 journals with what I can now recognize as the most thorough possible documentation of nothing that mattered. I was cataloging. I was being a very good cataloger. I was not, in any meaningful sense, looking. The hymnal changed that. I want to be honest about why. It's not only the story. It is the quality of the seeing in it. Margaret Adler watched those 4 days the way I had been watching everything, with attention, with care, with the instinct to record, but she watched it from inside the experience rather than from my cataloger's safe remove, and the difference between those two positions is not one of method. It is one of risk. She was risking something by watching that carefully. She was risking being changed. I think this is what the third day is really about. January 13th, something happened to the light today. I don't know how else to say it. The flat winter light we get here that makes everything look overexposed, it was different this morning. Angled. I stood in the yard and I could see shadows I haven't seen in months. Or maybe I just looked at the yard differently. Hard to know. This is the first line of the January 13th entry, and I have turned it over in my hands more times than I can count. The question she poses at the end, hard to know, is not rhetorical in the way that journalers use rhetorical questions to seem thoughtful. She's actually uncertain. She genuinely cannot tell whether the light changed or she did. Which means she knows that she has changed enough that the difference is no longer obvious. That is a significant thing to know about yourself, and a significant thing to write down. On the morning of the third day, the elder did something that disrupted whatever equilibrium the previous 2 days had established. He asked her to come somewhere with him. She understood this. She's clear in the account that the request was legible to her through a combination of gesture, repetition, and what she describes as the particular grammar of waiting that means, I am not leaving without you deciding. She considered it. The rifle occurred to me, she writes. Not as a plan. As a reflex. The way a word occurs to you in your first language when you're trying to think in your second. She left the rifle in the house. She went with him. They walked north, past the camp, past the frozen creek bed, up onto the high ground where the caprock flattens out and the sky gets larger and more honest. It is a walk of perhaps 40 minutes. She describes the ground conditions, the quality of ice in the grass, the way Hector followed them uninvited and was ignored with the same dignity he'd been accorded by the paint mare. The elder said nothing as they walked. She said nothing. This was, by now, an established mode between them. She writes about the walk with the comfort of someone describing a familiar thing, and it has been less than 3 days. This is the kind of sentence that, when I first read it, made me put the hymnal down and stare at the wall for several minutes. In less than 3 days, silence with this man had become familiar. Not strange. Not cautious. Not managed. Familiar. What the caprock does to you, given sufficient repetition, is strip away the noise you use to cover the fact that you don't know what to say. There is no ambient sound to fill gaps. There is only wind, and grass, and distance, and the choice to keep walking next to a person or not. Margaret had been choosing to keep walking next to nobody for 11 years. The elder had presumably been walking next to his people and his history and his own silences for his whole life. Together they walked north and said nothing, and it was, she writes, easier than most conversations I've had with people I knew well. What he wanted to show her was a place. She describes it carefully. A low depression in the caprock, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that announces itself, but a deliberate hollow, sheltered from wind on 3 sides by a natural rise in the rock. At the center of the hollow, some old fire circles. At the edge, something she has to approach to identify. Markers, she writes. Simple ones. I don't know the right word. Stones arranged with intention. Not graves, or not only graves, something more complicated than that. The kind of arrangement that means, people were here and this mattered. She stands at the edge of this place. The elder stands beside her. She doesn't know why he's shown her. She says so directly, I don't know why he brought me here. I didn't ask. Some questions are wrong for the place they're asked in. She is quiet for a while. She describes looking at the markers, at the arrangement of stones, at the hollowed-out oldness of the place, at the way even the frozen grass seemed different here, shorter, as if the ground had been tended once and remembered it. I thought about the post oak, she writes. Just that. She doesn't elaborate. She doesn't need to. The post oak, under which she buried Friedrich. The only tree for miles. The reason she stayed. She had brought the elder, by implication, her own version of this place, the place where someone had been and it had mattered, by letting him water his horses and eat her stew and sit by her fire. She had not known she was doing this. She had just done what practical people do and, then, been undone by a boy waiting for an old man to eat. He is showing her that he understands. Not her specific grief. Not her specific story. But, the grammar of it, the markers, the staying, the way a person builds their life around a hollow in the ground where something important went down. She is not the only one who has arranged stones. I am crying by this point, she writes. Which is embarrassing. I am not a person who cries easily or often. I am crying in a windbreak on the caprock next to a man I cannot speak to about a piece of ground I have never seen before. He doesn't look at me while I cry. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years. I put the pen down every time I get to this passage. I have read it perhaps more than any other passage in the account. Not because it is the most dramatic, it isn't, but because it is the most precise description of a specific kind of kindness that I have ever encountered in any document, personal or official, in 11 years of reading other people's accounts. The kindness of not looking. Of giving a person the dignity of their grief without witnessing it. Of being present without making the presence into an event. He stood beside her on the caprock and he looked at the stones and she cried and, when she was done they walked back down together. She writes nothing about the walk back. Either it was unremarkable or it was too full to be written about. I suspect the latter. That afternoon, she made a decision that strikes me as the third day's true center of gravity, though she writes it in 3 lines buried between a report on the cow's milk yield and a note about needing to mend the west fence before spring. Brought Friedrich's good coat out of the chest. The one I kept against the cold getting worse one winter than I could manage. Haven't opened the chest in 2 years. Coat still smells like him, which I had not anticipated. Set it by the fire. Let it air. We'll give it to the elder tomorrow if he'll take it. 3 lines. 2 years of an unopened chest. A coat that smells like a dead husband. The deliberate decision to open both the chest and the grief that comes with it, because there is a man in her yard who needs a coat. She doesn't moralize about this. She doesn't write about what it cost her to lift that lid. She notes the smell, which I had not anticipated, with the tone of a woman who thought she was prepared and discovered she wasn't, and has decided to proceed anyway. We'll give it to the elder tomorrow if he'll take it. If he'll take it. She knows it's a gift weighted with things he doesn't know about. She gives him the choice. She is generous with the offering and honest about its terms. This is a woman with an extremely sophisticated emotional intelligence operating entirely in a language of action, because the language of feeling had nowhere to go for 11 years and she had to put it somewhere, and she put it in decisions. The evening of the 3rd day is the most crowded passage in the hymnal. More writers came inside. Not all 7, I think some preferred the fire, preferred the outside, and this is simply preference rather than distance, but more than the first night. The boy brought in something she describes as a game, a thing with sticks and small stones that I will never understand the rules of, but I played for an hour and I am reasonably confident I won twice accidentally. She lost 4 times on purpose to make the younger children, she notes, here, for the first time, that 2 of the 7 were children, young enough that she'd taken them for slender adolescents in the dark, less embarrassed about beating her. She lost on purpose. She, who had lived alone for 11 years, reached automatically and unconsciously for the social math of let the children win, and she did not notice she'd done it until she was writing it down, and then, she writes, I suppose some things you don't forget. She doesn't say what things. She doesn't say how long it had been since she'd had children in her house. The dash appears again. Long pen on the page. Then, she keeps writing. The boy translated something for her, she thinks, a story the elder told, the sticks and stones game pausing, everyone listening in the particular stillness of people who have heard a story before and love it the more for that, and he used gestures and facial expressions and the kind of pantomime narrative that doesn't need language because it is language, and she followed most of it, and what she got was this, an old man. A hard winter. A door opened to strangers. Something given. Something returned. She doesn't write whether she understands that the story is about her. She just writes, the elder looked at me at the end of the story. Just for a moment. Then, I will think about that for a long time. The 3rd night she sleeps with the window unlatched. She has latched that window every night for 11 winters. She mentions this without emphasis, a single line about the window in the daily weather note, and then, it's done, and the entry ends, and the window is open a crack and the cold comes in a little and outside the fire burns and people breathe and she sleeps. I went back to the trading post outside Tascosa 3 times in the weeks after I first found the hymnal, on the pretext of following up on a different research thread. I was not following up on a different research thread. I was going back because the trading post was where I'd found it, and some part of my carefully maintained cataloger's detachment kept trying to drag me back to the moment before I'd read it, the moment when I was still a person who watched things from a safe distance. That moment was gone. The window was open. I was cold. I was, for the first time in 11 years of cataloging, inside someone's account rather than outside it. This, I understand now, is what Margaret Adler had been inside for 4 days. The difference between reading and living is not the information. It's the cold that comes through the window. It's the fact that you can't close it after, because you've decided, not dramatically, not in a moment of declaration, but, in the ordinary daily way that all real decisions are made, to let the air in. She unlatched the window. She went to sleep. Outside, fire. Breath. The sound of other lungs doing what lungs do. On the morning of January 14th, Margaret Adler woke before dawn and lay in bed listening to the silence. Not the familiar silence. Not the specific silence she'd been keeping company with for 11 winters, the silence that had shape and temperature and a kind of presence she'd stopped being able to distinguish from loneliness because they had become, by that point, the same thing. A different silence. The silence of sleeping people. There is a hush a camp makes when it breathes, she writes. Not quiet the way empty is quiet. Quiet the way held is quiet. I lay there and I listened to it and I did not move for a long time because I was afraid that if I moved I would remind myself it was temporary. She was right that it was temporary. She knew that on the first night and every night after. 7 riders on the Llano Estacado in January are not riders who have stopped. They are riders who have paused, and January does not negotiate with pauses. The cold was going to push them on. The trail, whatever trail they were following through whatever necessity the trail represented, was going to reassert itself. She had 4 days. She had not wanted 4 days. She had wanted nothing, because wanting nothing is how you survive not getting anything, and Margaret Adler was, above all things, a survivor. But she had gotten 4 days anyway, without asking, because a painted horse needed water and a man with patience had pointed at her well, and now she was lying in her bed in the dark listening to the silence of sleeping people and trying not to move. She got up. She made coffee. She made enough for more than 2. The coat was still by the fire where she'd left it to air. She took it in her hands, Friedrich's good wool coat, the one he'd worn in the photograph taken on their wedding day in Ohio, the one she'd kept back from the practical distribution of his things because it was not practical, it was the coat, and she had not been ready, and then she'd put it in the chest and then not ready for 2 years and then she'd opened the chest and it had smelled like him, which she had not anticipated. She held it for a minute. She looked at it. She put it over her arm and went outside. The elder was already up. Of course he was. He was standing at the eastern edge of the property looking east, which was his morning practice, which she had now seen twice and suspected was not a new practice but an old one, daily, lifelong, the way certain people greet the morning not with prayer or coffee but with simply facing it and letting it arrive. She walked toward him. He heard her coming. She makes a dry note about how even on frozen ground her approach is apparently audible. I have a farmer's gait, which is not subtle, and he turned. She held out the coat. He looked at it. She had thought about how to explain it and had concluded that explanation was impossible and had decided to do what she always did with impossible things, attempt them anyway and see what the attempting teaches you. I said some words, she writes. Not the 6 Comanche words, which I have now exhausted. Just words. His name if I'd had it. His existence if I'd been able to say it. I said Friedrich, which is not a word that means anything except that it was a man's name and I was saying it in front of another man and trying to give him something that had been a man. I don't know if any of that came through. The elder looked at the coat for a long time. He looked at her. He took the coat. He did not put it on immediately. He held it the way she'd held it, with both hands, with weight, with the particular seriousness of someone receiving something that is more than it is. He understood the more than it is. She is clear about that, he understood. I don't know how. He just did. Then, he did something she did not expect. He spoke. At length. Looking at her. Not the transactional brevity of the previous 3 days, water, stew, the morning nod that is its own full sentence, but something sustained, something that had sentences inside it and a shape, a structure, the clear grammar of a man telling a person something important. She didn't understand a word. She listened to all of it. I listened the way you listen to music you don't know, she writes. Not for meaning. For the shape underneath meaning. Whatever he was saying it the way you say the things you wouldn't want to leave unsaid. I stood in my yard in the January cold and I listened to everything he said and I don't know what it was and I will think about it for the rest of my life. When he finished, he put on the coat. She writes, it fit him well. And then, she moves on. Because she is Margaret Adler and the dawn is getting lighter and there are horses to feed and she has not yet determined whether the cow is going to be difficult this morning, and some part of her has decided, not dramatically, in the ordinary daily way that all real decisions are made, that the coat is given and the words are given and the rest is not hers to carry. She has held on to things long enough. She knows what it costs. The morning of the 4th day passes in fragments. She catalogues them precisely, which I think is her way of holding the morning in her hands a little longer by describing each piece of it, the boy helping her with the horses again, working in the same comfortable near silence as before. The children, she names them now, with the sounds she'd assigned to their features, the girl with the long braid and the boy who keeps touching Hector's ears, playing some complicated chasing game in the frozen yard while Hector tries to decide whether to participate. The woman with the blue-gray blanket sitting outside in the thin January sun, not much better but better, breathing with less labor, watching the children play with a specific expression Margaret describes as the look of a person who has moved past the worst of it and is surprised to find the world still going. She knows that look. She has made that look. Standing over Friedrich's grave. Standing over Lena's. The ongoing mild astonishment of the world not stopping. She fed everyone a last time. She'd baked bread the night before. She notes this is the most bread she's made at once since Lena was alive, and then, she notes nothing more about it, and the dash appears again, and she keeps going. They ate the bread. In the account I found, the actual departure has only one paragraph. After 4 days of careful, precise, almost forensic observation, the quality of ice in the grass, the angle of winter light, the specific way a man waits for an elder to eat, she gives the departure a single paragraph. I think this is intentional. I think she wrote it fast, without stopping, in the way you move through something that will hurt more if you move slowly. They left at midday. The elder first, then, the others falling in behind him the way water finds its direction, no hesitation, no looking back, and I stood at the corner of my house because it is where I stood when they arrived and it seemed right to be there at the end too. And I watched them go up the ridge and over it and gone, and the whole thing took less time than it takes to heat coffee, and then the yard was exactly the yard it has always been, and there was no fire and there was no sound, and Hector sat down next to my foot and we stood there together for a while. Then the elder looked back once. At the top of the ridge. Just once. I raised my hand. He was already facing forward. She doesn't say whether he saw it. She doesn't need to. This is where the January entries in the hymnal end. The next dated entry is March 3, 1876, 7 weeks later, 7 weeks she doesn't account for, 7 weeks during which I can only imagine she did what she had been doing for 11 years, which is surviving January in the particular way that Margaret Adler survived things, which is to say fully, stoically, with her hands and her back and her spare, precise attention. The March entry is about planting. The seed varieties she's decided on this year. The schedule she's keeping. The condition of the south field after the winter, which she describes as discouraged but not defeated, and I suspect she means both the field and herself. There is one line that is not about planting. I brought the chair back inside. She'd said she was going to. She waited 7 weeks and she did it. The Elias Brock account, from March of 1876, describes Margaret at considerable length longer than he describes most people he encounters, which itself is a form of testimony. He writes that she showed him the hymnal. She showed a stranger a document she'd never shared with anyone. He writes, she read me a passage and then she closed the book and she said, I keep wondering what he told me. I think I'll wonder that until I die. He asked her if that troubled her. She thought about it. She said, no. I think the wondering is the point. I think he knew I'd wonder. I think it was a gift to give me something to turn over. Elias writes, I do not know if this is wisdom or what remains after grief has taken everything else. Perhaps they are the same thing. I have thought about that sentence for 6 years. I think he's right that they might be the same thing. I think grief that has been lived all the way through, not around, not under, but through, the way Margaret Adler lived through it, with her hands and her back and her refusal to stop being warm even after she stopped being unguarded, becomes something that is not grief anymore but is not exactly peace either. It is the capacity to wonder. To keep turning something over. To be changed by 4 days of people you can't speak to and never know whether you were seen at the top of the ridge. I want to tell you what I did after I finished the account for the 3rd time, in the trading post outside Tascosa, in 1881. I opened my journal to the most recent page, which contained meticulous notes about a cultural contact incident that I had catalogued with great thoroughness and total emotional vacancy. I read what I'd written. I recognized it for what it was, the work of a man who was watching without risking anything. I tore the page out. I sat there for a while. The wind hit the walls. The lamp flickered. I opened to a fresh page and I wrote, "I have been doing this wrong." And then, I didn't write anything else for 3 days, because I was trying to figure out what right looked like, and I didn't know, and I have not yet fully figured it out, but I am working on it. I think this is what Margaret Adler would call the point. She lived on the property until 1891, when she sold the 80 acres, the cow long gone by then, the horses old, the kitchen garden still adversarial but responsive, to a family from Kansas, and moved to Clarendon, where she kept a boarding house for 11 more years and was known, according to a county social record I found, for 2 things: she could fix almost anything, and she always set an extra place at the table. The Comanche writers never returned. There is no second encounter documented anywhere, in her account or in any other source I found. What the elder said to her on the morning of January 14th, in the January cold, holding a dead man's coat, remains, as she predicted, unknown. I have my guesses. I will keep them to myself. Some things are private in the way that mourning things are private, and I have been a cataloger long enough to know the difference between a thing that should be documented and a thing that should simply be held. There is one more thing. In the back of the hymnal, past the hymns themselves, past the margins where Margaret wrote her account, past the back end paper, there is a single page of something that is not Margaret's handwriting. I am not qualified to interpret it. I have shown it to 3 people who have more competence in indigenous language documentation than I do, and gotten 3 different partial readings that agree on very little. What they agree on tentatively, with the caveats appropriate to incomplete evidence, is this: it appears to be a name. And something else. A phrase of some kind. Several words. The most careful reading I've received, from a woman in Albuquerque who spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work, was the name. Then, she kept the fire going. Or possibly, she kept the door open. Or, and this is the reading that has stayed with me most, though she offered it last and, least confidently, possibly, she stayed. The hymnal is in a box in a county archive in Amarillo. I put it there myself. I wrote a 3-page cover document explaining its provenance and significance. I used the correct subject headings. I organized it properly. Then, I left it there, because I could not keep it, because it was not mine. But I have carried it since then, in the way that things you've read all the way through stay with you, not as information but as presence, as a change in the quality of light on an ordinary morning, as the specific sound of a room full of sleeping people, as the crack of a window left unlatched. I still fidget with my pen cap. I am still nervous, most of the time. But I have started, in the years since, to make enough coffee for more than one. Just in case.